Break her, or everything we've built will fall with her. The chains didn't rattle when Elena Whitmore lifted her head. They tightened, as if the ancient temple itself was listening. Cold stone pressed beneath her knees, worn smooth by rituals older than memory, older than mercy. Above her, towering pillars carved with forgotten symbols stretched into darkness, swallowing the last traces of daylight that dared to slip through the cracked ceiling. The air felt heavy, like a storm that refused to break, thick with expectation and something else, something watching. Elena's breath came slow, controlled, though her pulse thundered in her ears. Around her, dozens of wolves stood in a silent circle, their presence pressing in like invisible walls. None stepped forward. None spoke her name. To them, she wasn't Elena. She was the offering, the mistake, the Omega born wrong. A flicker of movement near the edge of the altar caught her attention. A small creature, no larger than a house cat, its silver fur dulled by dust, one leg trembling as it tried to crawl away from the ritual markings etched into the stone. It didn't belong here. Neither did she. Elena's fingers curled slightly against the ground, instinct overriding fear for just a heartbeat. Even now, even here, something inside her refused to turn away from something weaker than herself. A whisper of warmth stirred in her chest, faint but stubborn, like a memory she couldn't quite reach. Stay still. A voice commanded from above, sharp and final. She didn't look up. She already knew who stood there, elevated above the circle, cloaked in authority and silence. King Lucian Blackthorn. The Alpha King didn't need to speak often. His presence alone bent the will of everyone in the room. Elena had never seen him this close before, but she felt him the moment she stepped into the temple, like gravity had shifted and chosen a new center. And yet, he hadn't stopped this. He hadn't stopped them. The markings beneath her began to glow, faint lines of pale light threading through the cracks in the stone, weaving around her like something alive. The temperature dropped, and a low hum filled the chamber, not loud, but impossible to ignore. The ritual had begun. Elena closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in focus. Somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the weight of every insult, every whispered, broken Omega, there was a quiet certainty forming. This wasn't just an ending. It couldn't be, because if this place had been waiting for her, then maybe she hadn't come here to be destroyed. Maybe she had been brought here for something else entirely. Her eyes opened again, steady now, and for the first time, she looked up, not at the circle, not at the priests, but straight at the king. And for a brief, fragile second, something passed between them. Recognition, not of who she was, but of what she might become. The light beneath Elena's knees spread outward in thin, deliberate lines, tracing the ancient symbols carved into the temple floor as if awakening something that had been asleep for centuries, and the low hum deepened into a steady pulse that echoed in her chest, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat until she could no longer tell where her body ended and the temple began, and still, no one moved to stop it. Not the elders standing rigid with expectation, not the guards stationed along the stone walls, and not the Alpha King whose presence loomed above them all like a shadow carved from winter itself. Elena felt it then, the shift, subtle but undeniable. The moment when fear stopped leading and something else took its place, something quieter, stronger, a certainty that did not ask for permission to exist, and her gaze did not waver as she held Lucian Blackthorn's eyes across the glowing circle, because now she could see it clearly. The stillness in him was not indifference, it was control, calculated and deliberate, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold. "You brought me here." Her voice broke the silence, not loud, but steady enough to carry through the chamber, and the reaction was immediate. A ripple of tension through the gathered wolves, a sharp intake of breath from someone near the edge, because Omegas did not speak during ritual. They did not question, they obeyed. But Elena did not lower her gaze, did not bow her head, because something inside her refused to shrink any longer. The glow intensified, casting soft silver light across her skin, illuminating the faint lines of strain in her hands where the chains held her in place. And for a brief moment, she became aware of the small creature again, now curled near the edge of the markings, no longer trembling, its bright eyes fixed on her as if it understood more than the others ever could, as if it recognized what she was only just beginning to feel, "Careful," one of the elders warned, his voice tight with unease. "The ritual must proceed as written." But even as he spoke, the symbols beneath Elena shifted, the light no longer following the prescribed pattern etched into the stone, instead bending, redirecting, responding to her presence in ways that should not have been possible. And a murmur spread through the circle, confusion laced with something dangerously close to fear. Elena's breath steadied further, the warmth in her chest expanding, no longer a flicker but a steady glow that spread through her arms, down into her fingertips where they pressed against the stone. And she realized then that the weight she had carried all her life, the sense of being wrong, incomplete, had never been emptiness at all. It had been containment. She lifted her chin slightly, just enough to feel the shift in the room, just enough to see the way Lucian's expression changed, not visibly, not to anyone else, but to her. The smallest narrowing of his eyes, the faintest tension in his stance, as if the outcome he had expected was no longer certain. "This was never about ending me," she said quietly, the words forming with a clarity that surprised even her. "Was it?" And for the first time since she had been dragged into the temple, no one answered, because the truth was no longer something they could control, and deep within the ancient structure, something older than their laws, older than their fear, stirred fully awake in response to her voice. The silence that followed her question did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with something unspoken, as though the temple itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would answer first. And for a moment, no one dared to move. Not the elders with their rigid authority, not the guards whose eyes now flickered with uncertainty, and not even the Alpha King, who remained perfectly still yet no longer seemed untouchable. Elena felt it in the shift of the air, the subtle change in how the others looked at her, not with dismissal anymore, but with confusion, as if the role they had assigned her no longer fit the person standing before them. And that realization sparked something deeper inside her, something that refused to be quiet again. The glow beneath her hands spread further, no longer confined to the circle, climbing the carved lines of the temple floor and reaching toward the base of the towering pillars, illuminating symbols that had not been seen in generations. And a soft vibration traveled through the stone, not harsh or violent, but undeniable, like a heartbeat awakening after a long, silent sleep. One of the elders stepped forward at last, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the fear beneath it. "This is not how the ritual unfolds," he said. But the words lacked the authority they once carried, because even he could see it now. The temple was no longer responding to them. It was responding to her. Elena slowly shifted her weight, the chains still holding her wrists, yet no longer feeling like restraints, more like remnants of a belief that was beginning to unravel, and she drew in a steady breath, grounding herself in the strange warmth that continued to grow within her chest, spreading through her like light finding its way through cracks. Her eyes lifted again, meeting Lucian's once more, and this time she did not search for permission or understanding. She simply looked, because now she knew he had been waiting, not for her to fail, but for her to awaken. "You knew it would not end me," she said, her voice calm, almost quiet, but it carried through the chamber with a certainty that could not be ignored. And for the first time, the Alpha King moved, just a single step forward, measured and deliberate, the faint echo of his boots against stone drawing every eye toward him. "I knew," he replied, his voice low, controlled, yet layered with something deeper, something that felt older than the temple itself, that the temple would choose. And that single word settled over the gathering like a truth they could not escape. Elena's breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition, because the moment he said it, she felt it fully, the pull beneath her feet, the connection threading through every glowing line, every ancient mark, every silent stone, as if the temple had been waiting not for a sacrifice, but for her specifically. The small creature near the edge of the circle rose unsteadily, no longer trembling, its gaze unwavering as it stepped closer, crossing the boundary that no one else dared to approach. And Elena felt a strange calm settle over her as it did, as though its presence confirmed what she was beginning to understand. The chains around her wrists gave a soft, almost inaudible shift, not breaking, but loosening, responding to the same unseen force that guided the light. And Elena did not pull away, did not struggle, because she no longer felt trapped. She felt anchored, connected to something far greater than the fear that had once defined her. Then it chose wrong. One of the elders said sharply, desperation bleeding into his tone, but the words fell flat, because even as he spoke them, the temple answered in a way no one could deny. The light surged brighter, steady and unwavering, wrapping around Elena like a silent declaration, and in that moment, it became clear to everyone present that whatever fate they had intended for her had already been rewritten, not by rebellion, but by something far more absolute, something that had always belonged to her, waiting for the moment she would finally stand and claim it. The light did not fade after the elder's words. It held steady, brighter now, as if the temple itself rejected the doubts spoken into its walls. And Elena felt that rejection as clearly as if it had come from her own voice, firm and unwavering. The chains around her wrists shifted again, a soft metallic sound that echoed louder than it should have in the vast chamber. And this time, the movement did not stop, the tension in them easing little by little until they no longer pressed into her skin, but rested there, loose, almost forgotten. And a murmur broke through the gathered wolves, low and uncertain, because restraints did not simply yield, not here, not during a ritual that had never once failed. Elena lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but to watch as the glowing lines beneath her feet extended further outward, reaching the base of each pillar, climbing higher along their carved surfaces until the entire temple seemed to hum with quiet, living energy, and with each second, the connection deepened, threading through her thoughts, her breath, her very awareness until she no longer felt like she was standing inside the temple, but rather that she was part of it. The small creature stepped fully into the circle now, its silver fur catching the light in a way that made it seem almost unreal, and it paused at her side, looking up at her with a calm that did not belong to something injured or afraid. And when Elena met its gaze, a strange understanding passed between them, wordless but undeniable, as though it had been sent not to be saved, but to witness. Step away from the altar. Another voice called out, sharper, edged with rising panic, but no one moved to enforce it, because no one knew how. Not anymore. And the Alpha King remained where he stood, his silence now heavier than any command he could have given. Elena slowly rose to her feet, the motion deliberate, unhurried. And the moment she stood fully upright, the temple responded, the light lifting with her, surrounding her in a soft glow that cast long shadows across the stone. And for the first time, she felt the full weight of every eye in the room shift, not down toward her, but up, following her movement, acknowledging it whether they intended to or not. "This place was never meant to take from me," she said quietly, her voice carrying with a calm certainty that silenced the whispers. It was waiting. And the realization settled over her as she spoke it, not as a sudden revelation, but as something she had always known beneath the surface, something that had been buried under years of being told she was less, that she was wrong, that she was expendable. Lucian took another step forward, closer now, his presence no longer distant. And though his expression remained controlled, there was no mistaking the shift in him, the acknowledgement, the acceptance of what was unfolding before him. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, yet it carried more weight than before. "The temple does not wait for the unworthy." And though the words were not directed at anyone in particular, they landed where they needed to, unraveling the last fragile threads of certainty among those who had orchestrated the ritual. Elena turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the circle of wolves who had once refused to meet her eyes. And she saw it clearly now, the hesitation, the disbelief, the beginnings of something that looked like recognition, and she did not look away, because she no longer needed to. The chains slipped from her wrists then, not falling with force, but simply releasing, as if they had served their purpose and were no longer required. And Elena did not flinch, did not step back. She only stood there, grounded and steady, as the light around her settled into a quiet, constant presence. And in that stillness, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Omega they had brought here to fulfill an ending was no longer bound to it. And whatever came next would not be decided by the ritual, but by her. No one gave the order. Yet the circle broke all the same, not with movement, but with distance, the wolves stepping back one by one, as if an invisible line had been drawn around Elena that none of them dared to cross, and the space between her and the others widened, turning the center of the temple into something sacred again, something untouched by fear or command, and she felt that shift as clearly as the steady warmth in her chest, a quiet reclaiming of ground that had never truly belonged to them. The light around her softened, no longer flaring or expanding, but settling into a steady glow that pulsed in rhythm with her breath. And for the first time since she had been brought into the temple, Elena felt fully present, not as the girl they had named Broken, not as the Omega they had dismissed, but as herself, whole in a way she had never been allowed to recognize. The small silver creature moved closer still, brushing lightly against her ankle before sitting at her side, its calm presence anchoring the moment. And Elena glanced down briefly, a faint, almost disbelieving softness crossing her expression, because even now, even in this moment of unraveling, something gentle had found its way to her, something that had not turned away. "This changes nothing," one of the elders insisted, though his voice lacked conviction and the words seemed to dissolve before they could fully take shape, because everything had already changed and everyone in the room knew it. Elena lifted her gaze again, steady and clear, and this time when she looked at them, she did not search for approval, she did not brace for judgment, she simply saw them as they were, uncertain, divided, and no longer in control. "It changes everything," she replied, not sharply, not with anger, but with quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to be defended, and the truth of it settled into the space between them, undeniable. Lucian moved then, closing the remaining distance until he stood at the edge of the circle where the ritual had once confined her, and though he did not step into it, his presence shifted the balance of the room once more, drawing every gaze back to him, waiting, expecting, because whatever he said next would shape what followed. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on Elena as if weighing something unseen, and then, slowly, he inclined his head, not a bow, not submission, but acknowledgement, deliberate and unmistakable, and the effect of it rippled outward through the gathered wolves, tension tightening, breaths catching. Because the Alpha King did not acknowledge without reason, Elena did not move, did not react outwardly, but inside, something steadied further, something aligned, because she understood what that gesture meant, not acceptance of her past, but recognition of what she had become. "The ritual is over," Lucian said at last, his voice calm, leaving no room for argument, and though it was not raised, it carried through the temple with finality, settling into the stone itself as if the structure had been waiting for those exact words. A few of the elders exchanged uncertain glances, hesitation flickering across their faces, but none stepped forward to challenge him, because the proof stood before them, unbound, unchanged in form, yet entirely different in presence. Elena exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried for so long easing not into weakness, but into clarity, and she took a single step forward, out of the circle that had once defined her place, and the temple did not resist, did not react, it simply allowed it, as if confirming what had already been decided. And as she stood there, no longer at the center of something meant to contain her, but at the beginning of something she could not yet fully see, one truth settled deep and unshakable within her. Whatever fate had been written for her here had already been left behind, and what came next would not be something she endured, but something she chose. The echo of the Alpha King's words lingered long after he spoke them, not as a command, but as a shift in the very foundation of the room, and Elena felt it settle into the stone beneath her feet, into the air she breathed, into the quiet space that had replaced the tension, and yet nothing truly felt finished, because endings did not feel like this, not when something deeper had only just begun. The temple remained illuminated, not as it had during the ritual, but with a softer, steadier glow, that no longer pressed against her but moved with her, as if the ancient structure had recognized her presence and chosen to follow rather than contain, and that realization stirred a new awareness within her, one that extended beyond the circle, beyond the watching wolves, reaching into the very bones of the place itself. Elena took another step forward, slow and deliberate, her senses sharpening in ways she could not fully explain, and as she moved, the faint lines of light along the pillars shifted subtly, responding to her motion, aligning with her path as though guiding rather than resisting, and she paused, her breath catching for just a moment as the realization settled more fully into her mind. This place was not just reacting to her, it was connected to her. Behind her, the murmurs had not returned, but the silence had changed, no longer uncertain, but watchful, cautious, and she could feel their attention without turning, the weight of their shifting understanding pressing gently at her back. The small silver creature followed her without hesitation, its steps light and certain, and when she glanced down at it again, she felt that same quiet recognition pass between them, as if it had always known where she would go next. "It is binding to her," one of the elders whispered, unable to keep the unease from his voice, and though the words were meant to be discreet, they carried clearly in the stillness. But Elena did not react, because she already understood that much. The connection was not something being forced upon her. It was something that had always been there, waiting beneath everything else. Lucian's presence shifted again as he moved a few steps closer, not entering her path, but no longer holding himself apart from it. And when Elena finally turned to face him fully, the distance between them felt different now, no longer defined by rank or expectation, but by something more complex, something that had not yet been named. "You feel it," he said quietly, not a question, but a statement of fact, and Elena held his gaze, considering the weight of that acknowledgement before she answered. "It has always been there," she replied, her voice steady, though softer now, shaped more by understanding than defiance. "I just did not know what it was." And for a moment, something shifted in his expression, subtle, but real, as if her words confirmed something he had suspected but never fully proven. The light along the walls brightened slightly, not dramatically, but enough to draw attention to the deeper carvings hidden beneath centuries of wear, symbols that had once been lost to time now visible again, and Elena's gaze drifted toward them, drawn by an instinct she could not ignore, because she could feel meaning in them now, not as something to decipher, but as something to remember. "This temple was never meant to take a life," she said slowly, the words forming as the understanding unfolded within her. "It was meant to protect one." And the implication settled heavily into the space around them, shifting the narrative that had governed generations, and for the first time, the idea of what they had almost done became clear to all of them, not as a necessary act, but as a mistake repeated for far too long. Elena turned slightly, her gaze sweeping once more across the gathered wolves, and she saw it now without doubt, the recognition, the uncertainty, and beneath it all, the beginning of something else. Something that resembled respect, fragile but undeniable, and she did not look away, because she no longer needed to prove anything. The temple had already done that for her. The glow around her steadied once more, settling into a quiet presence that felt less like power and more like belonging. And as she stood there, no longer bound, no longer defined by the fate they had written for her, one truth became clear in a way that could not be undone. She had not been brought here to end something. She had been brought here to uncover it, and now that it had been revealed, nothing would ever return to what it was before. The realization did not settle quietly. It moved through the temple like a shift in gravity, subtle but impossible to ignore, and Elena felt it ripple outward from where she stood, not as force, but as presence, as if something ancient had awakened fully and was now looking through her eyes, breathing with her breath. And the deeper that awareness reached, the clearer everything became, not in fragments, but in a whole she could finally understand. The carvings along the walls were no longer just symbols. They were memory, layered and patient, telling a story that had been misread for generations. And as her gaze traced them, meaning unfolded without effort, not learned, but remembered, as though it had always belonged to her. "They changed it," she said softly, the words almost lost in the stillness, yet they carried with a weight that drew attention once more, and when she turned back toward the others, her expression had shifted, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but knowing. "The ritual was never meant to bind or sacrifice," she continued, her voice steady. "It was meant to awaken the one who could keep this place alive, and the truth of it echoed against the stone, aligning with the quiet pulse of light that still moved through the temple, reinforcing what she had already felt. The elders did not interrupt this time, their silence heavier now, not from authority, but from the slow, dawning recognition that everything they had upheld might have been built on a misunderstanding they could no longer defend. Lucian watched her closely, his gaze unwavering, and though he did not speak immediately, there was no resistance in him, only attention, as if he had been waiting for her to reach this exact point, to say what he could not. Elena took another step forward, not toward him, but toward the edge of the chamber where the carvings deepened, where the light gathered more intensely, and the moment her hand lifted, hovering just above the stone, the glow responded, rising slightly to meet her without contact, a silent acknowledgement that made the breath catch in more than one throat around the room. It was never about control, she said, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. It was about balance, and as she spoke, the faint hum within the temple shifted again, not louder, but fuller, resonating in a way that felt complete rather than strained. The small silver creature moved beside her once more, settling near the base of the wall as if guarding the space, its presence steady and calm, and Elena felt a faint warmth at her side in response, a reassurance she did not question. Behind her, one of the elders finally found his voice, though it carried none of its former strength. If that is true, then why has it not awakened before now? He asked, and it was not a challenge, but a genuine uncertainty, and Elena turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Because no one was listening, she answered simply, and the honesty of it left no room for argument. Because for the first time, they all understood what that meant, that the temple had not failed. They had. Lucian stepped closer then, closing the final distance between them until he stood just within the edge of the light, and though he did not reach out, his presence aligned with hers in a way that felt intentional, not imposed. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, not authority alone, but acknowledgement of something greater than either of them. And now it is, he said, and the quiet certainty in his tone settled into the space between them, reinforcing the shift that had already taken place. Elena exhaled slowly, the last remnants of doubt slipping away, and as she stood there, surrounded not by expectation or fear, but by something steady and real, she understood that this moment was not the end of a trial, but the beginning of a truth that would change everything that came after, because the temple had not chosen her by chance. It had waited, and now that she had answered, there would be no returning to what had come before. The temple no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a place that had finally been understood, and that shift settled into every corner of the chamber, quiet but absolute, reshaping the way the wolves stood, the way they breathed, the way they looked at the Omega who no longer fit the role they had given her. Elena remained still for a moment longer, her hand hovering near the ancient stone, feeling the steady hum that now felt as natural as her own heartbeat. And as she lowered her hand slowly, the light followed the motion, not fading, but settling, as though it no longer needed to prove anything. The carvings along the walls glowed faintly, their meaning no longer hidden, and though no one else could read them as she could, they all felt the change, the shift from something imposed to something restored. Behind her, the elders did not speak again, because there was nothing left to argue. The ritual they had relied on for generations had not just failed, it had been revealed as something entirely different, and that truth carried more weight than any command they could give. Elena turned back toward the center of the temple, her gaze sweeping across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply seeing, and for the first time, no one looked away from her, because there was no longer a reason to dismiss her, no longer a place to hide. From what had become undeniable, Lucian stood only a few steps away now, close enough that the quiet strength of his presence no longer felt distant, and when their eyes met again, there was no tension in it, no test, only recognition, clear and unguarded. What happens now? One of the wolves asked from the edge of the chamber, the question breaking the silence in a way that felt different from before, not driven by fear, but by uncertainty of what came next. Elena did not answer immediately, because the answer was not something she had been taught. It was something she was still beginning to understand, and as she stood there, grounded in the steady glow that surrounded her. She realized that for the first time, she was not reacting to a path set before her. She was choosing one. The small silver creature rose and stepped forward again, moving toward the center where the ritual circle had once held her, and it paused there, looking back at her as if waiting, and Elena felt the pull. Again, not strong, not urgent, but clear, guiding her without force. She took a step forward, then another, crossing the space that had once defined her role, and as she did, the temple responded in kind, the light shifting to follow her movement, aligning with her direction rather than holding her in place. Lucian watched her closely, but he did not move to lead, did not speak to direct, because whatever came next was no longer his to decide, and that understanding settled into him just as clearly as it had into her. Elena stopped at the center once more, not as a sacrifice, but as something entirely different, and she let her gaze lift toward the highest point of the chamber where the last traces of natural light filtered through, blending with the glow that now belonged to her. And in that moment, the connection deepened again, not overwhelming, but complete. "We rebuild it," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the temple with a quiet authority that did not demand attention, but received it all the same, not as it was told, but as it was meant to be. And the words settled into the space like a promise, not of control, not of power, but of balance. Restored. No one challenged her, because they could feel it too, the difference, the truth in what she had uncovered. And as the silence returned, it no longer felt uncertain, it felt resolved, as though something long broken had finally been set right. Elena stood there, no longer defined by what she had been called, no longer bound by what had been expected, and as the light steadied around her, one thing became certain in a way that needed no further proof: the future of the temple, and everything connected to it, would not be decided by fear or tradition again. It would be shaped by the one who had finally listened and chosen to stand. The temple did not dim when her words settled into its walls. It held steady, as if recognizing not just the truth she had spoken, but the choice behind it. And that choice carried further than any ritual ever had, reaching into every corner of the chamber and into every wolf who stood there, no longer as witnesses to an ending, but to something that had only just begun. Elena remained at the center, not because she was bound there, but because she chose to stand there, grounded and certain. And the light that surrounded her no longer felt like something separate. It felt like an extension of her presence, calm and unwavering. And as she breathed, it moved with her, subtle, natural, as though it had always been part of her, waiting for the moment she would finally accept it. The silence that followed was no longer fragile. It was full, steady, carrying a sense of resolution that did not need to be spoken aloud. And one by one, the wolves who had once turned away from her began to lower their gaze, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, because they could no longer deny what stood before them. Lucian remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on her with a clarity that held no doubt. And then, slowly, he stepped forward, closing the final distance that had once separated them. And this time, when he moved, there was no hesitation in the room, no uncertainty in what it meant, because everyone present understood that this moment would define what came next. He stopped just before her, not towering above, not asserting dominance, but standing beside her, equal in presence. And after a brief pause, he inclined his head once more, deeper this time, deliberate and unmistakable, and the weight of that gesture settled across the chamber like a quiet declaration, one that needed no explanation. Elena did not step back, did not falter. She simply met his gaze, steady and clear, because she understood what he was offering. Not control, not ownership, but recognition of the truth that had revealed itself. And for the first time, the space between them felt balanced, not defined by power, but by understanding. The small silver creature remained near her side, calm and watchful, its presence a quiet reminder of the moment everything had shifted, and Elena allowed herself a brief glance downward, a faint softness crossing her expression before she lifted her gaze again, returning fully to the present. "Then it begins here," Lucian said quietly, his voice carrying through the temple with a certainty that aligned with everything she had uncovered. And Elena gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in agreement with him alone, but with the path unfolding before her, the one she had chosen. The light within the temple responded once more, not flaring, not overwhelming, but settling into a steady, enduring glow that filled the space with quiet clarity. And for the first time in generations, the ancient structure felt whole, not because it had taken something, but because it had been understood. Elena took a slow breath, feeling the connection within her settle into something lasting, something that would not fade when she stepped beyond these walls. And as she turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the entrance where faint daylight waited beyond the shadows, she felt no hesitation, no pull to remain where she had once been trapped, because she knew now that the temple was not a place that confined her. It was a part of her that would follow wherever she chose to go. And as she took her first step forward, not as an offering, not as someone defined by fear or fate, but as someone who had seen the truth and chosen it, the silence